All right, wonderful. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the CAI Florida Legislative Alliance Condo Safety Legislation Update. I do want to give you a couple housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, if you have any questions during the session, if you would use the Q&A, we will get to as many as we can. We have several hundred participants on the call today, so obviously it will be hard to get to all of them, but we will try our very best. The chat is closed, so I do want to note that. Make sure you're using the Q&A feature. I do want to let you know that this is general information on the new condo safety law. This is not legal advice, and so we would recommend, if you have additional questions, to reach out to the professionals that you meet through your chapter or the professionals you already are working with. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Michael Bender, and he's going to get us started.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for putting all this together. I want to welcome everyone. Good afternoon. As Emily mentioned, my name is Michael Bender. I'm an attorney with the Community Association law firm of K. Bender Rembaum, and I'm the current chair of the Community Associations Institute Florida Legislative Alliance. I want to once again thank you for joining us today. CAI, as many of you hopefully know, is a nonprofit organization representing the interests of the 73 million people living in HOAs, condos, and housing cooperatives here in the United States. In Florida, there are nearly 10 million residents living in community associations, and these homeowners pay over $17 billion a year in assessments to fund services and amenities provided by their associations. CAI provides education, best practices, standards of practices, tools, and resources for the volunteer boards of directors that govern these communities, the professional managers, and other business partners that serve the community association housing model. The CAI Florida Legislative Alliance is the statewide committee of CAI representing the interests of Florida condominiums, cooperatives, and HOAs. And in my opinion, what makes FLA, Florida Legislative Alliance, so unique is that it's made up of delegates from all parts of the state, and we represent so many different industries that work with and serve community associations. And so I just want to, I have a few of my fellow volunteer delegates, FLA delegates serving as panelists today. Alan Jowers, a CPA with Carr, Riggs & Ingram, Steve Rappaport, an attorney with Sachs Kaplan, and Pilar Willis-Dixon, who is a CIC-CIRMS Brown & Brown insurance agent. Those are designations that Pilar has earned through Community Associations Institute, and she's a Community Association insurance agent. I also am very pleased to tell you we have on our panel Travis Moore, our lobbyist up in Tallahassee, who hopefully all of you know, who's our hardworking lobbyist day in, day out for FLA, and Dawn Bauman, our Senior Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for CAI, as well as the Executive Director of the Foundation for Community Association Research. And it's a pleasure to have the two of them as great resources to help us present to you today. So with that, actually, I'm going to pass the baton, proverbial baton, Dawn, over to you and ask you to get us started. Dawn's going to talk about the how CAI National has been working with the states, the United States, as well as Florida itself on safety legislation.
Thanks, you so much, Michael. Welcome, everybody. And Michael, thank you for your leadership on the Florida Legislative Alliance. It was a busy year, of course, and you and the entire team did an amazing job navigating a lot of obstacles and challenges and negotiations that I think ended up being better for Florida condominium owners. So thank you for all of your hard work. I wanted to take an opportunity to just give a little bit of background to help set the story for what ultimately passed in Florida this special session. So following the condo collapse in Surfside last summer, CAI convened a group of individuals, our Government Public Affairs Committee, that has oversight of all of our public policies. We convened an emergency meeting to talk about what we could do as an organization to make sure that we can give some solutions to policymakers looking for solutions to make sure this doesn't happen in their jurisdiction to their constituents, or so that this condo collapse doesn't ever happen again. So that meeting led to a 5-long initiative with 3 task forces of hundreds of people throughout the US and Canada looking at specific policy recommendations that could help keep condos more safe. We did a lot of research on laws here in the US, as well as laws in other countries, specifically because building inspection laws are quite minimal here in the US. They exist in several jurisdictions, but not in any state until Florida just passed their law. We had conversations, and we continue to have conversations with organizations like the National League of Cities, the National Society of Professional Engineers, National Association of Counties, Building Inspectors, International Code Commission, National Association of Housing Co-ops, and others, to make sure that we're all working together to identify solutions that can be valuable for people living in condominiums. Another area that we looked at was we did a really deep dive into federal programs that may be able to help provide resources for buildings that are in critical need of critical repairs. And we'll talk about some solutions that we've been able to move forward in Congress as a result of those deep dives. So, as I mentioned, these conversations and weekly meetings with hundreds of people throughout the country, and one of your Florida attorneys, Lisa McGill, who is also a representative on the Florida Legislative Alliance, she chaired one of our task forces. These volunteers put in hundreds of hours over a 5-month period to develop really great solutions for policymakers to be able to adopt. We adopted ultimately on October 28th, 2021, our condo public policy recommendations. A lot of these recommendations were taken to, we adopted this in October. In November, your Florida Legislative Alliance was in Tallahassee meeting with legislators, offering these solutions and providing these solutions, handing out this condo public policy publication. And I think, and Travis will tell you, that a number of the legislators were really very grateful to have the substance of this report to be able to help navigate some of the conversations that were happening in Florida. And by the way, it's not just Florida. So a number of other states have passed laws and have introduced laws that will help make condominiums safer. So please go to our website and download this document. It provides not just the policy recommendations, but a list of a variety of laws that exist in other states and jurisdictions. Do I have another slide, Emily, or is that my last slide? I think it's my last slide. Thank you. Okay, so a couple of, just a little bit of an update on what's happening around the country. State legislation. So building inspection, very similar to the Florida building inspection legislation that was also introduced in Hawaii, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia. Florida and Virginia passed legislation. New Jersey is still in session. I'm guessing they will also pass their legislation. Virginia is slightly different than Florida in that Virginia just passed a bill looking for a study of what building inspections should look like that they'll reconsider in the 2023 session. Reserve studies, mandatory reserve studies passed in Florida, Illinois, and Maryland, 3 states that did not have mandatory reserve studies and funding previously. There are also 2 pieces of federal legislation. There's the SAFER Act, which was introduced by your own Representative Charlie Crist and Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz. They introduced 2 bills. The SAFER Act, this act provides for funding for critical condominium repairs for individual homeowners. And it's a low interest loan that individual homeowners can be eligible for to pay their special assessments for critical repairs. Now, when that was introduced about a month ago, which was, we were pleased that this bill was introduced. but we continued to push to say what's going to be better is if a condominium association can take out a loan instead of individuals having access to low interest loans. So what was just introduced just last Friday, again, Representatives Wasserman Schultz and Charlie Crist introduced the Rapid Financing for Critical Condo Repairs Act, which is House Bill 8304. And that makes available a low interest loan product insured by the US HUD's FHA to underwrite loans or insure loans for condominiums at a low interest rate for critical funding repairs. We're very pleased to see this movement and think that if we can engage some of you folks, and I'll put something in the chat to contact your members of Congress, we may be able to get this legislation moving forward. And then finally, we continue to work with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on their condo lending requirements, which we all recognize are are disruptive right now in closings for condominiums. So we continue to work with Fannie and Freddie to make changes to those requirements. I am hopeful that in the coming months we will see some changes, but that is it's quite a project because it's such a bureaucratic project or process with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to make changes to those requirements. That's the status of where we are from other states and the federal government. So I would like to turn it over to Travis Moore so he can talk a little bit about what happened in Florida this year and where we finally landed with the special session. Travis, you are a phenomenal, amazing lobbyist, and everyone on this call should know how lucky we are to have Travis representing us in Tallahassee.
Well, thank you, Dawn, very, very much. That's very kind, and I appreciate it and consider it an honor to partner with not only you, but with all those that work and serve and volunteer their time in community associations and the common interest ownership setting. So just briefly, I'm going to be very brief to provide a little bit more context before we then launch into really the meat of what passed with our subject matter experts. The first thing I want to mention is that the legislation which passed during the May special session and then was signed by the governor at the end of May and is now the law here in the state of Florida was all language that was discussed and debated and voted on in committees and on the floor in some fashion during the regular session of that went from January through March. And so nothing new that had kind of came out of left field or had not been part of those negotiations or discussions passed. It was all things that had been out there. And as Dawn mentioned, at the end of October, CAI, along with other organizations like the engineers, et cetera, had their working group studies that were presented to the legislature starting there in November. And so we really had been working on these issues for months. When the regular session ended and nothing had passed on building safety issues or really on insurance as well, another hot topic for associations. Certainly CAI's work didn't stop. The regular session may have ended, but our work did not. So we continued to work with policymakers and say this is something, whether or not you address it in the next regular session in 2023 or now, needs to be done. A big part of that is because certainly the building inspection piece, the public sector was already beginning to move, and it moves a lot quicker than the private sector had already started to move and moves a lot faster than the public sector. So things like insurance carriers and mortgage lenders, et cetera, were starting to ask for information regarding building studies, building inspections, issues pertaining to the financial stability of associations and their reserves, et cetera. So it was with knowing that when they called a special session for insurance, we knew that there was a nexus there and we wanted to at least get the building inspection piece included. The policymakers, along with the governor and others, thought, well, we need to do more than just the building inspection piece. So they brought along also some of the reserve issues and things that we'll be talking about as well. So it's important to keep in mind that that while this law today that is now the law. Much of the requirements do not take effect for some time yet. That's in no way a reason to be apathetic or be asleep. As an association, you still need to be very much engaged. As I even said, whether or not the law requires it, your insurance carrier certainly may. But it does give us some time, meaning that the legislature will have an opportunity in the 2023 session, in the 2024 session, to continue to work and fine tune the new law. And so, as always is the case, CAI will be working to make certain that the new law is workable, practical for associations, while making sure that certainly safety is not sacrificed. I kind of will wrap up by saying that this new law was certainly meant as a wake-up call to those associations, certainly not all, but those associations that we all are aware of that may not have been keeping up with the structural maintenance and the proper financial planning that needs to be occurring on a regular basis. And so in the aftermath of the Champlain Tower South tragedy, the message certainly from policymakers is clear, that complacency and procrastination, that's no longer going to be tolerated. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael so that we can begin that discussion on what actually passed and was signed there by the governor at the end of May 26th of this year. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you, Dawn. Again, appreciate you guys taking the time to be here and share this information. And everybody should know that both Dawn and Travis work tirelessly on behalf of community associations. Dawn nationwide, but I've worked with her for years, and she's very active in helping us in Florida. And Travis, obviously, he's a rock star in Tallahassee for us. Even though we can't always get what we want, it's certainly through no fault of his or lack of effort. So again, thank you both. So what we're going to jump into now, I'd like to have one of my attorney colleagues in the community association industry, as well as a fellow FLA delegate, Steve Rappaport, join us to talk about the building inspections, the milestone inspection. And Steve, before we get into that, I did want to just remind everyone, I wanted to point out one item that did pass in the legislation that does apply to all condominium and cooperative associations, and that's the information reporting requirements. So on or before January 1st, 2023, condominium or cooperative associations that existed on or before July 1st, 2022, so everybody in existence now, must provide the following information to the division in writing by either email, United States Postal Service, a commercial delivery service, or hand delivery at a physical address or email address provided by the division on a form posted on the division's website. So again, I'm understanding there's supposed to be a form that's posted on the division's website. And Steve, to your knowledge, has there been a form posted yet?
I have not seen it yet.
Okay, and neither have I, and I haven't, and so hopefully they will have a form, because it is creeping up quickly on January 1st, 2023. But on this form, which should be self-explanatory if and when it gets up there, the number of buildings on the condominium or cooperative property that are 3 stories or higher in height. And for those buildings 3 stories or higher in height, you'll also need to put the total number of units in all such buildings, the addresses of all such buildings, and the counties in which all such buildings are located. Okay, so again, there should be a form, and once there is a form, I'm sure you'll see email blasts from Steve's office, my office, many of the other panelists on here, reminding people there's a form. But by January 1st, 2023, those are your new reporting requirements. I saw a couple of questions asking about that. I hope that clarifies. So now, Steve, what I'd like to do is basically turn it over to you now to talk to us about the building inspection requirement in the new legislation, in particular the milestone inspection. I know Emily has a slide for that.
All right, thanks, Michael, and thanks to everybody else for putting this together and being a part of this. Milestone inspection requirements, I think we'll start at what exactly is the milestone inspection. It's a structural inspection of the building, including the inspection of all load-bearing walls and primary structural systems. It's required to be performed by a licensed architect or engineer, and it's to attest to the life safety of the building, the adequacy of your structural components, the general structural condition of the building, which affects the safety of the building, and a determination of any necessary maintenance, repairs, or replacements of any structural components that would be necessary for the building's safety. It's divided into two types, phase 1 and phase 2, which we'll get to in a little while. But first I want to go through who actually has to comply with these inspections. First and foremost, it's applicable to condominiums and co-ops. So if you're a 720 HOA, a 721 timeshare, mobile home, this does not affect you. It's a 718 condominium or a 719 co-op. It only applies to those buildings 3 stories in height or more. So if you're a 1 or a 2-story condo or co-op, you are not required to go through the milestone inspection report. So it's 3 stories in height or higher, first and foremost. Then the timing of this will depend on how close you are to a coastline. So if you are within 3 miles of a coastline, you are required to have this performed within the 25th year after your original CO. So on your 25th anniversary, by December 31st of your 25th year, you will be required to have this performed, and then every 10 years after that. If you're not within 3 miles of a coast, it's by your 30th year after inception, and then every 10 years after that. So again, we start off with 3 stories in height or higher only. So if you're below that, we don't even worry about it. Then the second question you need to ask is, are we within 3 miles of a coast? If we are, then we have to do this by year 25, and then every 10 years after that. If we're not, and we're outside that 3 miles of a coast, then it's by the 30th year and every 10 years after that. Now, you may be coming up on those deadlines this year, because if you were created prior to 1997, and you were outside the 3 miles, or if you were prior to 1990 or 1992 and you're outside the 3 miles, you'll be coming up on your 30th year this year. If you were created before July 1 of 1997, you'd be coming up to your 25th year if you're within 3 miles of a coast. So what the legislature did is they built in a 2-year grace period, so that if you are within 3 miles of the coast and would otherwise have your 25th year coming up this year, or if you're not within the 3 miles, you're outside the 3 miles, but you'd be coming up to your 30th year this year, you're given an additional 2 years so that you must have this completed by December 31 of 2024. But very, very important to realize these dates. And if you're a much older building, that date's going to be coming up fairly soon. So getting into the milestone inspection, again, it's separated into phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is basically just a visual examination of the building. The licensed architect or engineer will give a visual assessment of the building, including the major structural components, and provide a qualitative assessment of the structural conditions of the building. If the architect or the engineer finds no signs of substantial structural deterioration to the building after the visual inspection, then phase 2 won't be required. So the phase 1 is just a visual determination by the engineer as to whether or not there's any signs of substantial structural deterioration. Now, assuming that they do find some signs of structural deterioration, then we move to phase 2. And that is done again by the licensed architect or the engineer, may involve destructive or non-destructive testing. It's a much more advanced inspection into to fully assess the areas of the structural distress, to confirm that the building is either structurally sound or safe, or whether or not additional repairs or work needs to be done to bring the building into a proper condition. And what that's going to do is it's going to result in a milestone inspection report that's going to be required to be submitted by the person conducting the phase 2 inspection. And what that's going to do is it's going to be signed and sealed by the licensed engineer or architect. It's going to indicate the manner and type of inspection that was performed for the basis of the report. It's going to identify any substantial structural deterioration and describe the extent of such deterioration, as well as identify any recommended repairs for the deterioration. It's going to state whether unsafe or dangerous conditions were observed, and it will recommend any remedial or preventative repairs or measures for any items that are damaged but are not substantially deteriorated. And finally, it will identify and describe any items that require further inspection. So that's really the inspection report requirements and what's contained in the report in a nutshell. Michael, I don't know if you want to come in with anything further or if there were any additional questions in the Q&A that we can address.
There are a couple of questions. Michael, do you want to do them or you want me to ask them?
Go ahead.
Sure. So does an association have to, if they're less than 3 miles, but they're single-story buildings, do they have to conduct a milestone inspection?
Yeah, if you're under the 3 stories, you do not have to conduct the inspection regardless of where you're located.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a big one, by the way. That was a big question that I see from a lot of attendees. The questions popping up had to deal with, hey, we're under 3 stories. What do we do? And then Dawn, there's the question about the garages, Dawn. You have that one too?
Yes, if the garage is the bottom floor, does it count as the first story?
Yeah, I get that question a lot as well. And my feeling is that that's one of the stories. It's 3 stories total, whether it's garage or livable space.
I agree.
And again, this does not apply to timeshares. Is that correct?
That is correct. As I understand it, it's a 718 and 719 issue. Yep.
Okay, excellent.
Yep, good stuff. Let's see if there were any other questions that were put in. I mean, again, a lot of them happen to be the same. You know, they want to know, Steve, you talked about this, how much time will associations have to comply with the new laws? And I think you touched upon this already, and I think we need to go basically what the law is today. You know, while we do have legislative sessions upcoming in January 2023, what we are looking at now is compliance by December 31st, 2024. And you should be communicating with your experts, your engineers. If you have an engineer you're working with now, I would communicate with them as soon as possible as to getting on their schedule if this law applies to you.
Absolutely.
If anybody has another additional comment on that.
What if the partial building is 3 stories and the other part of the building is 2 stories?
Yeah, that's a great one, because I got that question a couple of times. I always err on the side of caution and being conservative. If you're one of these that has attached townhomes, and maybe some are 3 stories, some are 2 stories, I think just have the report done. If any portion of the building is 3 stories, I think you want to err on the side of caution and just get the report done for the entire building.
Okay, here's one, Steve. What does it mean in the milestone inspection to review windows, and how does that impact with the owners? You know, if the owner responsibility for window maintenance?
You know, I'm certainly not an engineering expert, but look, it's going to be part of the structural report. It's going to be part of the whole thing. So if it winds up being an owner responsibility under the documents, you know, that's something that you can work out with the association when it comes to that time. I mean, bottom line is these things need to get reviewed. You need to review the report. It's possible the association may need to take on some responsibility. Anyway, it might be easier for the association to coordinate some repairs, but that's something that's going to be worked out individually with your building, and probably a question more for your individual association attorney when it comes to that point.
Right, that's where I was going to go. I said I spot on, Steve. I answered the same way, and Emily mentioned this earlier, guys. You know, we're here. We're sharing the information we have, and based on, you know, the reading of the statutes, the legislative intent, what we know with our experience, but we don't necessarily have. We're not necessarily a panacea of answers, unfortunately. We do encourage you, and Steve, your point there was spot on. It's not necessarily a case-by-case approach, but if you have specific questions about your buildings, you do need to take these to the experts that hopefully you have assisting you with your engineers, your management team, your legal counsel, your insurance agents. So we encourage you, we remind you to be doing that. Let's see, all right, so let's see. Then there's a bunch of questions we'll get with Alan on reserves. Okay. So, anybody,
Questions?
Yes, Dawn.
Michael, a couple of questions just regarding timing. So let's say the building is in Miami-Dade County. They did the 40-year inspection, then they did the 10-year inspection. Do they now have to go back and do the 25-year inspection?
I mean, I'll give you my opinion. I'll give you my opinion based on only what I've heard. And again, my information, Dawn, that's a great question. I know that something comes up, and I'm going to let you get, and by the way, I just saw someone ask, what's the coastline? Another great question. So we don't necessarily have answers for these. My answer to your question though, Dawn, is my understanding, I should say, is, and this is from talking with some engineers, is if the 40 years research or certification that you did covered everything that this milestone inspection covered, you should be able to use that to be in compliance. However, if there are aspects of the milestone inspection that were not covered as part of that, then what you want to be doing is, either way, you want to be talking to your engineer and finding out, you may be able to supplement the 40-year certification with this additional quote unquote milestone inspection, and as opposed to having to do everything again, you could just do the points that you missed. But that's why you need to be, if you've had one recently or you're in the middle of one, you need to be communicating with your engineer, who should be qualified obviously to do these milestone inspections on this 40-year certs, and find out what more you need to do. But I don't think you can say, hey, we did the 40-year cert, we're good. That's my opinion.
Michael,
And does the timing, does the clock start on the certificate of occupancy? When does the clock start? The
Yes.
first certificate of occupancy? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
yeah. And Michael, this Travis, there was a question in there about if a building is older than 30 years, does it get the 2-year grace period that Stephen talked about? And yes, I mean, the earliest you would need to start that anybody, even if they were already 30 years, would be the 2024 date.
Right. Well, yeah.
Or have it
exactly.
completed.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody have any other questions that they've been asked that they want to get into on this subject matter? I'm looking now to see if anybody else threw some new questions on here. Give me a second. All right. Well, thank guys. We appreciate the questions. As you see, we're trying to hit what we can as we go. All right, Steve, thank you very much. Appreciate that. We are going to now move on to the second part of the Senate Bill 4D, and that would be bringing Alan, our friend Alan Jowers, into the fold. Alan, why don't you talk to us, if you will, about the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, SIRS, and reserve funding aspects. And I will tell you that as many questions as there are on the milestone inspections, there are at least as many, if not more, on this portion. So share. Feel free to be very, share a light, share everything you got.
Great. Looking forward to it, to all of those questions. But thank you, everybody. My name is Alan Jowers. I am a CPA with Carr, Riggs & Ingram. We've got offices all over the state. I happen to be in the lovely area of Destin, Florida, which, if you're not familiar with that, is about as far north and west as you can get in Florida. I'm actually in that part of the state that's in the central time zone. So it's 11:30 where I am, where most of you are, it's 12:30. But I do want to talk about the Structural Integrity Reserve Study and then how that impacts reserve funding going forward. So this is a requirement that is completely separate from what Steve just talked about with the milestone certification. So that happens every 25 or 30 years, depending on where you're located. This structural reserve study is going to be due every 10 years. And it is going to look like the reserve studies that many of you already have, where you're going to have an engineer looking at specific components and showing when the estimates of when those will need to be replaced and how much those are going to cost. So we'll start out, it's there on the PowerPoint, you'll see that this is a new requirement. It's required every 10 years for each building that is 3 stories or higher. So it does not apply to buildings that are 2 stories and lower, just like we talked about with the milestone. So if you're a garden townhouse that's 2 stories, doesn't matter whether you're within a mile or 10 miles of the coastline, that's not going to apply to you. If you're a multi-condominium association, what that means is that each building within your multi-association that's 3 stories or higher will have to have its own reserve study. So you might have buildings within your multi-association that do require it, and some buildings that might not require it. But every 10 years, if you're 3 stories or more, condominium or cooperative building, you're going to have this requirement. So what it does is it lays out 10 required components that you have to have reserve study prepared for. And I'll read you the list. It's roof, load-bearing walls, the floor, the foundation, fireproofing and fire protection, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows, and then anything else that's over $10,000 that would have an impact on the previous 9 items that I just mentioned. I think the ones that you'll see on the PowerPoint are kind of the ones that we're more familiar with. If you've had reserve studies prepared in the past, you've already covered roofing, you've already covered painting or waterproofing. So those items won't be new. There are some items that are on this list that historically I have not seen in typical reserve studies, things like the floor and the foundation. So those might be some new items that you'll have to include. And who knows, engineers will know how often you have to repair your foundation or replace your foundation. I don't know how you replace a foundation, but anyway, those 10 items are the items that are required in the reserve study. Now, what you won't see on there are some things that we're familiar with on reserve studies. So you won't see like parking lot repaving. So that's outside of the structural integrity reserve study, unless it happens to fall in that item where it could have an impact on one of the other 9 items. I've seen reserve studies with pools on them. You won't see pools in the structural integrity reserve. I've seen them with pool furniture because people want to reserve up to replace pool furniture. You won't see that. The only thing that you'll see on that structural integrity reserve study are those 10 items that are laid out in the statute. So when are these due? The structural integrity reserve study, if you have a developer controlled association, is due prior to turnover. And then if you have a unit owner controlled association, then you are required to have this structural integrity reserve study completed prior to December 31 of 2024. So you've got about, what's that, 2.5 years now to get that structural integrity reserve study completed. And just like your regular reserve study you use in the preparation of your reserve funding with your annual budget, this structural integrity reserve study is going to impact the reserve funding for those 10 particular items that are laid out in the statute. So if we go forward and we'll take a look at how this kind of impacts the reserve funding on a go forward basis. So what you see is that when we're going through and calculating our annual budgeted reserves, if you have an item that is in the structural integrity reserve study, then that amount is going to come straight from that reserve study. So if you have a reserve study that says for painting and waterproofing, we need to reserve $30,000 a year for the next 10 years, then that number, that $30,000 number, is going to come directly off of that structural integrity reserve study. So for any of those 10 items, that number is going to come straight off of that reserve study. If you have an item that's not included in a structural integrity reserve study, and that can be because you are under 3 stories tall, that can be because you're a 10-story building, but paving is not covered under structural integrity reserve, it's under normal reserve study. It can be because you haven't had your structural integrity reserve study completed yet. We might be in the year 2024 and you don't have it completed yet. So if there's an item that's not governed by a structural integrity reserve study, then we fall back on what I call old school reserve funding, where you're just going to say, here's the estimated cost, here's the estimated useful life. We're going to use some algebra that we learned back in 7th and 8th grade. And we're going to figure out how much we have to fund for these particular items that are not included in the structural integrity reserve study. So we're going to have those 2 pieces. The first, structural integrity reserve study, is going to tell us exactly what to do. Secondly, we're going to have the old school component method of how we're going to calculate the reserve items that are not included in the structural integrity reserve study. If you are a unit owner controlled association, so you're past turnover, you can still vote to reduce or waive reserves currently, except for, and that's the big bullet is bullet number 4. Starting on December 31 of 2024, you are not allowed to waive or reduce funding on any of those 10 items that's included in your structural integrity reserve study. And that's the big change from the past. So for those associations, and I think Travis mentioned this earlier, this was kind of the wake-up call for those associations who have historically waived reserve funding on their building safety items, those 10 items that the legislature laid out. Starting in 2.5 years, you're not going to be able to waive the reserves on those specific 10 items. Now, according to the way that I'm reading it, I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play a lawyer on TV. But according to the way that I'm reading it, you still have the opportunity to vote to waive or reduce those reserve items that are not included in those 10 structural integrity items as identified in the statutes.
Alan, I agree with that interpretation, and I do play a lawyer on TV.
So what a did so they're going on to the next bullet point, a developer controlled association. According to the way that I'm reading it, I don't believe a developer controlled association has the ability to waive reserves at all. That's the way that I'm reading that. And then, as I mentioned, those top 10 items, those SIRS 10 items, you cannot reduce or waive the funding. And then secondly, and this is the bottom bullet point, you are not able to take an ownership vote to move the money out of those 10 components and use it for some other purpose that was not originally intended. So currently, if you have a lot of money in the painting, but you need money in the repaving in the parking lot, you could vote as an ownership group to move the money out of the painting and put it in the parking lot and repave your parking lot. Effective 12/31 of 24, that will no longer be an issue or an option, because we're not going to be able to vote to move money out of those 10 structural integrity reserve study items. So it really, I think it was clear the intention of the law was we're going to make sure that our condo associations in the state of Florida kind of keep that structural integrity money sacred. We're going to require you to put it in there, and then once it's in there, we're going to require you to use it for those specific building structure integrity and safety items, and really kind of taking that option off the table for the ownership groups of the condominiums and the co-ops. Again, I think somebody mentioned earlier, this does not apply to homeowner associations. It does not apply to timeshare associations. These new reserve studies and reserve funding rules are in 718 condos and they're in 719 cooperatives. So Michael,
let me add a couple of things and ask you some questions or let you get back. One thing I want to just point out, because I want to just clarify for all of our attendees, and Alan, by the way, thank you very much for summarizing what is complex for sure. And there are still a lot of open questions. We understand that, and there's still interpreting to be done. But I do want to remind everyone that the ability to waive or partially fund reserves is not automatic to the membership. It is a board discretionary item. Boards of directors have the discretion and have had the discretion, and going forward for at least the next couple of years, have the discretion to say, we're not going to waive reserves. We're going to start funding these reserves, whether it's fully or partially. It's, fully fund. If the board decides they want to do something less than fully fund, that's where they go out to the membership and say, hey guys, do you want to partially fund? Or historically, some communities have waived year after year. So I just want to remind everyone, it is the boards you're using your business judgment, using what you determine to be in the best interest of your condominium or cooperative, can say, hey, fully funding reserves is best for us going forward. So just keep that in mind. It is board discretion. That board discretion goes away in December 31st, 2024. As Alan pointed out, on those 10 items, the board would no longer have even the ability to pass to the membership the ability to waive or partially fund, or to use funds for a purpose other than for which they've been designated, if it's within those 10 required items. One of the questions that came up was asking about what if it's not one of those, and Alan was talking about, and the best example I think we use is the paving. And then again, Alan, I thank you for reminding everyone the paving, it doesn't, generally speaking, paving likely is outside of that structural integrity reserve study, but keep in mind that catch-all that Alan did point out, that if for some reason the paving or the pool somehow, like if the pool was on the deck or something like that, and it had an impact on the structural integrity of the building, those items likely would be need to be included in the SIRS, the Structural Integrity Reserve Study. But for purposes of my comment, this comment, let's presume that they are not impacting the structural integrity and are outside of SIRS. Then the ability to waive or partially reduce or use those funds for another purpose, all with the proper membership vote, still remain in my interpretation of the way the statute was drafted. And you will want to communicate with your association counsel, get opinions in writing, and get clear direction as to how you go about doing what you can do to make sure that you as a board management team are best protected. So Alan, did you have more on your to go, or should I just hit you with questions now?
No, it's time to be hit with questions.
Okay, and Dawn, if you see some, please also join in. Okay, well, this question, I think, Dawn, I'm going to throw this to you, and I think because you've been asked this question that you've been answering. So they're saying, will associations be allowed a time extension?
Me?
Well, I think we all, I've seen you answer this question. I think we all answer unsure. And
Unsure.
Yeah, guys, we
as
can't.
Of right now, no, don't plan on it.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I would, and I mentioned that I think earlier about the milestone inspection. Nobody should be, you guys should not be looking at next legislative sessions as an opportunity for them to delay this. It's more, I think, I don't know what to think, actually. I'm just going to leave it at that. Good job, right, Tom? I did good there.
Can the funds for the structural reserves be pooled, or must they be individual for each component?
That is a good question. At this point, I don't see anything in the legislature that allows for the pooling of those structural components. It specifically says, I mean, the language is pretty clear. For the structural integrity 10 items, you're just picking that number straight off of the structural integrity reserve study. So I don't see anything in the statute as it's written that allows for pooling, but that's one of those things where I think that may play out in practice. But for right now, I don't think pooling is an option.
And Alan, I think I agree with you that it is it's a good question. It's a question that we've gotten a lot of. I've gotten a lot of it independently. I'm sure Steve has as well. And really, I'll ask it this way: can the pooled method for reserve funds, which separates those 10 items, keep that as a pool for those 10 items, and then you have a separate fund for the quote unquote non-structural items? And I'm not asking Alan for you to answer that question. I'm just saying, I mean, that's the type of question that I think a few of us asked up front, and these are the types of questions that I think are very good. And I think these are the types of questions that need clarifying. And I agree with you, through practice and perhaps through next session, we'll get some clarity on some of these.
Can you, Alan, can you just quickly define what pooling means for those in the audience who might not know what that means?
Sure. The pooling method, sometimes referred to as the cash flow method, it's where you take a group of reserve components and kind of put them all together and fund them as one group. So it's not, contrast that to the component method, or the way that it has historically been done, where each item has its own line. And so you would have 100 grand in this line, 100 grand in this line, 100 grand in this line, where a pool would put all of that together and say, okay, for the 3 items in this pool, now we have $300,000. And it gives the associations more flexibility, because these reserve studies are, I mean, they are scientific guesses. Like we can't go into the future and say exactly how much your roof is going to cost to be repaired. We don't know exactly what problems will occur with your painting and waterproofing. So we do the best we can as far as estimates, but pooling allows for a little bit of additional flexibility. I think the concern, and I think Michael, you said it right, if there is some sort of pooling, it's going to take those 10 structural items and say, if you're going to pool it, you have to pool these by themselves, because the concern is we don't want you to drain the pool of funds to fix the parking lot and leave us underfunded for these structural items. So I think if there is going to be pooling, if there is going to be grouping of these reserve components, it's going to be structural items to the left, non-structural items to the right. And if you were drawing a Venn diagram, those two circles would not intersect.
I think that's I think I agree with that. And I think here's a quick one. There's a couple saying, does reserve funding apply to anyone that's below 3? Does this reserve funding apply to condos or co-ops that are less than 3 stories? And I think, Alan, you had specifically said it's 3 stories or higher for the structural integrity reserve study. To clarify, though, if you are under 3 stories, you still are required to fund your reserves under the statutes, fully fund your reserves under the statutory calculations that, what was your term for it? The current, well, the one that we have there?
The component method, or the old school method.
Old school, right? The old school method. So you're still required, if you're under 3 stories, to be adopting a budget with fully funded reserves. However, you continue to have the discretion, board members, to say we want to less than fully fund and put a vote out to the membership to get their approval.
That is correct.
Alan, this is Travis. It seems to me like there's a confusion regarding the term fully funded. And I'll ask it like this: doesn't that mean I'll put it this way, that you need to have day one the entire amount that you know that you're going to need to have 100% of what you need in 12 years to replace the roof to be considered fully funded? Or does it mean you're at least funding up to the level of that the reserve schedule as laid out in the SERS is telling you to fund, so that when you get to the 12 years, you've got what you need to pay for it. You don't have to sit there with 100% of it every year 1 through 12, correct?
That's the way that I read it, that you have a plan to get to what you need to repair the items, right, whenever your reserve study says to repair. So to give you an example,
when I hear that, that's what I thought. Okay, because I see the fully funded, and everybody thinks, all right, I'm going to need $250,000 that I got to sit on for 12 years. But that's not what it's. If you know you're going to need $250,000 to fund the roof, that's what the reserve study says. That as long as you're meeting the reserve funding schedule and putting in the X amount of dollars every year to get you there, you're fully funded.
That is correct. You're fully funding on an annual basis. You don't have to have all the money in currently. That's just a real simple example. You're going to need $100,000 in 10 years. So fully funded would be $10,000 a year over the next 10 years. Fully funded does not mean I've got $100,000 on day one. That's yes.
Yeah, because that's not a reserve study. That's just an account. I mean, that's not a reserve fund. That's just All right.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Continuing on, let's see.
We have a slide that lists all 10 components of the structural reserve study.
I did not put that. I gave the example of a handful of them. I did not include all 10 items.
Can you list those again? Do you have them at your fingertips? Because
I do.
Everybody's asking for it.
All right. Are you okay? It's roof, load-bearing walls, or other primary structural members. So load-bearing walls. So roof, walls, floor, foundation, fireproof and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows, and then the catch-all item, any other item that's over $10,000 to repair that would negatively affect those previous 9 items. And so a lot of those we already have seen in historical reserve studies, things like roofing, painting, windows, and then there's some things that we have not seen in historical reserve studies, at least the ones that I've seen, like the foundation, the plumbing and electrical systems inside of the condo.
You know what's interesting, Alan, like you saw, what about cooling tower? What about elevators?
Yeah, those are not listed as part of the the 9 specific items. They might be in that 10th catch-all.
Right.
But something like elevators, I'm not sure that an elevator would have an impact on the structural integrity of the building. But historically, that has been something that people have reserved for: elevator modernization, elevator refurbishment.
Right.
So to me, that would kind of fall into group number 2,
Right.
not the
Right.
structural integrity, but the historical stuff that we've reserved for.
And that's the and I thank you, because that's the reason I want to reiterate that to our attendees, and that's the point. The structural integrity reserve study is not intended to be the catch-all for everything that you are required to reserve for. This isn't replacing your current reserve requirements. It's likely adding to it, and it is, as Alan has well pointed out, it's separating perhaps for structural, and we'll call it quote unquote non-structural, all of which still continue to need to be addressed when you're adopting your budgets with reserves. It's just a matter of at some point post 2024, which of those you'll have to be fully funding without the ability to waive or reduce or use for another purpose, and which of those items you will still continue to be able to waive, reduce, or use for another purpose, again with the proper membership vote. I think that's really what we're looking at.
Alan, this is a good question that I've seen a couple of times. What if the windows are the responsibility of the owners?
Contact Michael Bender of K. Bender Rembaum.
Or your attorney.
Yeah, yes, I would say, I mean, there will be a million different variations of these types of questions. And so because I mean, as you know, each association has its own set of documents.
Right.
So sometimes those documents are going to add and subtract and multiply and divide to the Florida statutes. So if windows are part of the unit owner's responsibilities, I think you'd have to consult your own attorney to figure
Absolutely.
out how your documents interplay with this new legislation that just came out.
Absolutely. That is something that has been asked a lot. It continues to be asked a lot, will continue to be asked a lot. And as Don said and Alan said, I encourage you to communicate, reach out to your community association lawyer to get guidance, and we'll do the best we can with what we have right now. But it is document specific as far as who's responsible for windows, and with their owner responsible, then there is the question of how is the association reserving for an item that the owners are responsible to maintain on their own.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen that in townhome associations where the individual unit owners are responsible for the roofs. So if you have a 3-story townhome and the unit owner is responsible for the roof, then how does the association reserve for that? So I think, again, there's going to be situations like that where, you know, individual associations are going to have to consult their attorneys.
Okay, Alan, let me ask you, let me throw one more out at you and the group also that has come up, and you touched upon this early on when you were presenting. So we have the SIRS, the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, which does now require the first part being a visual inspection that must be performed by an engineer licensed under Chapter 471 of Florida statutes, or an architect licensed under Chapter 481. And we also are aware of this milestone inspection requirement, both of which have similar initial deadlines. And if you mentioned this, I missed it, so I apologize. But I've had questions come up as, hey, so if we're having the milestone inspection, if we have the engineer out there doing the milestone inspection, can't we kind of have them also do this first part of this SIRS as well, the visual inspection at the same time?
I think the answer to that is yes. It's 2 separate products. So you'll have to work with your engineering firm or your architect firm to have those 2 separate deliverables. The milestone inspection being one, the SIRS being the second item. But if they can send one person out one time and kind of kick off both products, then that might be a situation where an association can save a little bit of money, assuming that you're using the same engineering or architectural company to do both of those products. So I think somebody mentioned earlier, you know, if your engineer is out on site right now, you know, go corner them and
yes,
and go ahead and engage them to get these sorts of products done. I did see one of the items in the Q&A where they're like, well, these engineers are already overwhelmed and booked up for months. And I think that's correct. I mean, this is like this has been a great thing for engineers and architects. They're going to be busy for the next 5 years. So go ahead and get on their dockets, because
and that was one of the questions that has been posed too, is hey, what is there enough of is there enough labor force available for this? And that's a practicals matter that's going to have to be addressed, going forward. But I agree with you. I think, and I mentioned that earlier, if you're working with an engineer, get with that engineer now and do this analysis, at least find out from them what they can do, when they can do it, give you a proposal, try to get into their queue. And if you're not working with an engineer, but have recently worked with one, reach back out to them. But I'd be proactive in this regard, and consider that your deadline is December 31st, 2024 for both Milestone and CERS.
And one other thing I'd add to that, and this is kind of a shameless plug for CAI. I know when I go to the CAI monthly chapter meetings, I run into people from these reserve studies, these engineers, these architects. So if I saw a question on the Q&A, if you don't have one, my suggestion would be either contact your chapter executive director or attend a chapter meeting and just start a conversation, because the business partners, like the attorneys and the CPAs and the engineers, at least in my part of the state, we pretty faithfully attend those monthly chapter meetings. So that would be a great place to kind of get a start on people who they're engineers and they're architects, but they know the condo industry and they're familiar with what it takes to put these sorts of studies together.
And most of the chapters or the national website has a service provider directory of engineers, reserve study professionals, etc., that you can also tap into. Alan or Michael, if an association has already conducted their reserve study, and they do it regularly every 3 years or so, and all of the components of the structural integrity reserve study are included in their regular old reserve study, are they good? Or do they need to have another one just because it's a different name?
Again, I'll give you my opinion, and it's similar to the question we talked about with the Milestone inspection. If they have conducted a reserve study that encompassed everything in the CERS, which would be which would be surprising, quite frankly, because as Alan pointed out, there are certain items in the CERS that really nobody was considering as far as reserving for. But I think if they've checked every box, they're in compliance, because because they are already reserving for all of those items. That would be my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. My follow-up to that would be, and this is language directly from the statute. If an association fails to complete a structural integrity reserve study pursuant to this paragraph, such failure is a breach of an officer's and director's fiduciary relationship to the unit owners. So they're telling you, if you don't do this, then board members, shame on you, and you're opening yourself up under breach of fiduciary responsibility. So if you check all the boxes, like Michael says, then I think you're probably okay. I doubt that you will check all of those boxes. So if I'm a board member, I'm having one of these done personally. But then I'm a conservative CPA, so.
All right, so
I don't think the intent of the legislation was to rename anything, right? So the intent was just the intent. And if a reserve study provider is not using the terminology CERS, which has only been created amongst our group, that's okay. The intent is to have these components reserved for and funded for, and that's it.
100%.
It doesn't matter what the name is.
Right. It doesn't. So if you've checked all the boxes under whatever title you have, you're good. If you haven't, then you need to make sure you do. Alan, again, Dawn, thank you. Alan, thank you very much. We want to bring Pilar in. Pilar, you've been so patient for us, and Pilar's our insurance guru and a fellow volunteer delegate. So I want to bring Pilar in. And Pilar, if you would share with us the impact from the insurance company perspective, the insurance agent perspective, and obviously all the attendees are listening carefully, because insurance is certainly of concern. So Pilar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. So one of the most critical things to remember is that your underwriters have an expectation that you are, as an association, are in compliance or will be in compliance with these deadlines of these new laws. So keep that in mind, that that's an expectation of underwriters. The compliance also should take into consideration the being financially prepared for the expenses associated with these milestone inspection and structural integrity reserve studies. There are, as we've discussed, some different elements that haven't been considered in the past. And if those things apply to your association, you certainly should be considering the current law as it is written right now. And the cost associated with maintenance and repair of your buildings. That is an expectation of underwriters. Over the past few years, specifically in the last year, underwriters are requesting additional information regarding the inspections and the engineering reports. If you don't have one and your underwriter is asking for that, or a condition report of your association's property. We have seen underwriters, not just property carriers, but also GL carriers, general liability carriers, issuing non-renewal notices because they can't get the information that they want. They want the understanding and the that your association is both financially healthy and stable, as well as that your property is being maintained. All of the insurance carriers will continue to focus, underwrite, and price your policies based on this information, structural integrity, as well as integrity of the components. So for an example, this past month, I had an underwriter non-renew a general liability policy, and their reasoning was there were 2 claims involving stairwells. The stairwells had not been properly maintained and they failed. In order for this association to obtain a policy that actually had coverage for the stairwells, they paid triple their expiring premium. So you all need to prepare and understand that as this legislation is written, is what the insurance carriers expect you to be in compliance with. We also have, as Travis mentioned earlier, this session was really outlined to focus on insurance carriers. And what we're hoping is going to happen as a result of this legislation is that there will be additional carriers that are attracted to the state of Florida because we do have these laws in effect, and that the expectation is the buildings are maintained and our associations are healthy. There's been a lot of questions on the directors and officers piece and the crime insurance coverage. Financials will be a standard underwriting tool going forward. You should expect to receive that request from your agent 60 to 90 days in advance of your renewals, because the underwriters are going to be taking that into consideration on your renewals. We've talked about the breach of duty for directors and officers for failure to obtain these reports, and the underwriting questions are becoming more intense regarding both the education of the board members and regarding meaning the education about the documents, and also the composition of the board. Those are underwriting questions that we're seeing now. So your underwriters and your premiums are going to certainly be reflective of the condition of your building and your financial stability. So don't delay in getting these, being prepared for the inspections and the proper reporting.
Okay. I didn't know I didn't want to cut you off. All right.
Nope. We can talk
have
about it for a very long time, but it is going to be, underwriting is going to get even more strict, and everyone is accustomed to seeing premium increases. Some associations have seen non-renewals in the past. This is just going to be even more information that the underwriters are going to be asking of the associations.
So, you mentioned there that some underwriters are requiring inspections, these engineering reports for renewal. Are you saying, and again, I apologize if I missed this, but to clarify, with the report, the milestone inspection report is what we've been talking about with the new law, which obviously they don't have to have until the end of 2024. Are they requiring some kind of report now? And I'll piggyback onto this by saying I have a few clients who've had trouble getting renewals, even with Citizens, and about when they're having their roofs, they have a roof inspection and their Citizens is telling them you need to do repairs. They're doing these repairs. Then and I'm not going to go down the road with the specifics, but just in general, you're talking about milestone inspections in 2 years. You're talking about they're requiring these types of not as statutorily required, but as general engineering reports.
Well, what the insurance carriers are looking for is the overall condition of the property. So the fact that we now have legislation that outlines all of this is certainly more helpful to the insurance carriers. And again, hopefully this attracts some additional carriers that will come to our state and write policies, which creates competition. And we all know that that is healthy. So condition reports, not necessarily an engineering report. I've had different underwriters request different reports, but primarily they're looking for conditions of the property.
Okay.
And just to add to that, Michael, it's not only for the property insurance. We're having general liability carriers ask for this, as well as D&O carriers.
Okay. And again, here's a question that I'm not expecting you to have definitive answer, but this question came in. Will insurance companies accept the results of a CSRS inspection as proof the association has taken steps to mitigate losses from storms? It's not clear if these are previous storms, and again, I guess perhaps they're talking about previous storms and then they got this report, but what in general, what do you think, how are insurance companies going to react when they get these CSRS inspections that show, I presume, and based on the question, that show that this board, they have the report and they've taken action to address it?
That's exactly right. As long as they've taken the action to address it, I think the reports are going to be very helpful. And I think it's going to be a positive for the associations that are in compliance, are maintaining their buildings. I think it's going to be a very positive.
Okay. Any Dawn, Travis, Steve Allen, anybody have any other questions on the insurance aspect? I am not seeing any other questions on here. Well, Pilar, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I have a feeling that you're going to be needed a lot more as we move along with this and your expertise. So what I'd like to do then is we're going to wrap up in a moment, but before we do, I'd like to actually, Emily, ask you to rejoin us. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And before I do the final wrap up though, Emily does have some important information to share about connecting to your local chapters. So Emily, where are you?
I am right here. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all. Wonderful job. And we've had a lot of questions about, will we be providing the presentation, the recording, and the answer is yes. Give us a few days to get that together and we will send that to all of the registered participants. So I think some of our panelists did an amazing job promoting our chapters and the resources that they can offer. So I have a slide here and I will send this to you with all of the information about our chapters, how to reach them. It has a link to their websites so that you can access that. It has a link, so you'll just be able to click on it. Many of our chapters offer monthly events. They also offer publications. And as they mentioned earlier, they also have business partner directories, a lot of them. So you can go on and search by attorney, reserve specialist, engineer, accountant, and search and find all of the members who are in that chapter. So I would definitely encourage you to get engaged that way, to check out a CAI meeting. They're going to be continuing this discussion at the chapter. They're going to be doing calls to action for you all as the next legislative session kicks off next year. So if you have any questions, I work very closely with all of the 8 chapters in Florida, and I will be glad to get you in contact with them. So thank you again to the panelists, and I'll turn it back over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Emily. And let's get everybody up here so everybody I can see and say thank you again to everybody. I want to very much appreciate everybody who attended. I hope that we were able to give you some better, some more information probably you didn't have. I want to thank my fellow delegates, Alan Jowers, Steve Rappaport, and Pilar Willis-Dixon for your excellent information and sharing. And of course, Travis Moore and Dawn Bauman for your continued education and support of community associations nationwide, and in particular in Florida. And before I check off, I know Dawn had some resources that she wanted to share. So Dawn, did you want to share a few more resources before we say goodbye?
Sure. I think, Emily, if you just go back maybe 1 or 2 slides, probably the most, there you go, this one is good. The most valuable link I can give you is caionline.org/condo safety. It has, you'll find access to a variety of resources, publications, guidance documents, links to legislation, etc. at that particular link on our webpage. So feel free to go there for additional resources. Thank you, Michael. Thanks,
thank you. And again, guys, I mean, I think I say this very objectively. CAI obviously is a tremendous resource for all of us who live and work in the community association industry. So Dawn, thank you, and thank everybody there for what CAI does for us at community associations. And I encourage everyone to go to these links and get these resources, as well as utilize the CAI industry, business industry people, all of whom are on here. And again, Travis, can't thank you enough for all that you do. Emily, you as well, of course. Thank you very much, Emily, for everything. And I want to, again, just thank all our attendees for coming by, spending the last hour, 20 minutes with us. Wishing everybody a summer that isn't too hot. Stay safe, and just keep your eye out for further emails and for more webinars, hopefully some in-person things in the future, and have a great summer. Thank you.